Greetings, System Failure listeners. Nate here, and Brian over there with System Failure Podcast number 91. Well, Brian, I dread asking you how you're doing today, because I got a call from you this morning. We usually film this podcast in the morning where we can guzzle huge pots of coffee and not impact our sleep, and then chatter on excitedly about all things system failure. But this morning, my phone goes off, highly unusual, and it's Brian on the other end. And Brian, what did you have to say to me this morning?
That I'm dying of dysentery.
Yeah. You said that you had the plague, but you were like, I'm sure if we just delay the recording of this podcast by like 6 hours, that I will be in much better shape. And so when I came through the door this afternoon, my coffee buzz long having expired, I expected to find you up and about and a little more chipper and a little the better for wear. But you look like you were in a truly sad state and that the 6 hours didn't help at all.
Well, I wanted to make it through 100 episodes of the System Failure Podcast, but unfortunately I'm probably going to die after this one.
Well, I hope it's not as bad as all that. But yeah, you do seem like you're in quite a state there. Now, you mentioned the culprits. You feel like this is food poisoning, right? Hopefully not a fatal case of food poisoning.
Hopefully not.
Yeah. And I think you had mentioned you mentioned that like you did have sushi yesterday.
Yeah.
And that's like the perennial culprit for, giving people a horrible case of the trots. But you feel like but you also have this tin of Starbucks, coffee grounds you're making coffee with, and that's just arousing your like third eye, your inner psychic mind recoils in horror at the Starbucks and not the sushi. Have I got that right? Yeah, well,
the Kume in South Portland I've been to many times, and I've never felt the worse for wear, and the salmon seemed fine that I got my sushi rolls. I guess you'd probably have to assume it was that as opposed to this Starbucks instant coffee, although, I had a lot of stuff to do for work, and I've been super jacked up on Starbucks instant coffee all week, and it is like straight caffeine. It's like hot chocolate, if it was just caffeine.
I see. Well,
and you add some like a little heavy cream, and it's kind of like an unholy creation. And so I don't know. My feeling is I'm never doing anything unhealthy again after this week. But I do look forward to providing some feverish insights to the System Failure podcast this week.
Whenever I'm sick, I make a fist with my hand and palm it into my pound and declare that I too will never take my good health for granted ever again. And then on like an hour after I feel better, I'm still eating bad things or what have you. But it sure is, man. When you sure miss feeling good when you don't. It's like you can't believe you ever took it for granted.
Well, it's a bummer. My mission for this weekend was to fall asleep on the weekends without listening to any YouTubes. Yeah. Which is during the week, I try to do that and take a cold shower. It's part of the grind, and that seems to treat me pretty well. On the weekends, I usually just say F it because I'm going to sleep in anyway, and I'm sure that'll balance out not sleeping as well from listening to the YouTubes.
And so you were able to implement this plan over the past week?
Yes. I mean, I wanted to do it on the weekend because then you can really get a good night of rest. But I guess I technically did it, but I only slept for like 3 hours or maybe like 2 to 5 or something like that. That's after, retching piteously into the toilet numerous times.
If we could quickly, away from that horrifying image, just return to like the identifying the culprit of your terrible disease. I just have this feeling like your subconscious knows. There's a lot going on beneath the floorboards of your consciousness. In the plumbing, in the dark basement of your subconscious. And I just feel like if you had alcohol and you drank, like a particular kind of booze. Everyone has that one booze they can never have again because they drank way too much of it one night, and now the very thought of it turns their stomach. Their subconscious just knows that it has a bad energy. So I just feel like the fact that the thought of the Starbucks coffee nauseates you, and not so much the raw salmon down at Kume. That I just feel like that. Maybe that's reliable. What do you think?
I mean, I'm inclined to agree. It just kind of sounds like a crazy hypothesis. But if you knew what this instant coffee with like some heavy cream dumped on top was like, it might surprise you less.
Is it possible that the heavy cream could have been a vector for the pathogen with which you now find yourself afflicted?
Maybe. I bought that cream like 2 weeks ago, I think, and it has a bizarre expiration date of like June 6th. And, it's like, suspicious. So it was in the middle of May when I got it. And I guess that's just the way cream works now. Like when I was growing up, like milk expired in some kind of reasonable time frame, I think. And I really don't understand, apparently, the shelf-stable heavy cream that's available.
We shall have to inquire with our parents as to what the expiration dates were like in the 80s. Just one thing, and we should definitely bring this up to our parents next time we see them. But one relic of the 80s that I really remember, do you remember the canisters of frozen juice concentrate that we used to make? Those were, I can still taste the plasticky. Because you would shake them up in some kind of a plastic container.
Yeah, some poor person juice.
Yeah. I think that Tropicana, not from concentrate, became popular in 1994 or something, and then all the frozen juice concentrate went away. Do they still sell it? Have you seen it in the Hannaford's?
I'm pretty sure it's still there, especially if you go to the Save-A-Lot. I think we got out of the price demographic, thankfully.
Yeah, that's man, interesting way that they used to do things. I'm sure that people maybe folks who remember being young in the early 90s will remember those bizarre canisters of, you would pull a tab. It was like a cardboard canister with metal ends, and then I would slide this icy block of hyper sweet frozen juice concentrate.
Yeah, you would add 3 things of water of the remainder of the container. Licking the top of the lid with its crazy grape syrupy concentrate was a real titillating affair.
Yeah, well, you of course would ruin the juice for everyone else in the household, but the concentrate was all the sugar with none of that wasted, water, diluting the precious sugar.
Well, you pull the lid off, right? You just lick the lid, and you don't have to put it back in.
You're right. You're right. The syrupy lid. I remember doing that. You're exactly right. Yeah.
The grape, doing that with the grape and the lemonade was pretty awesome.
Woof. Yep. Yeah, I remember. I remember those. I can just still taste the syrup. Well, Brian, in the first half of this episode, I had thought maybe I would read this 2013 essay from the late great David Graeber about bullshit jobs.
Not to be confused with Commander David Graeber.
Yeah,
the UFO guy.
Yes, not to be confused with Lieutenant David Graeber, who got to declassify his FLIR videos from 2003, I think that was, in 2018 or something like that. And we can see some of the Tic Tac UFOs flying around on it. And the man seems totally credible and sober, like you'd expect a officer who's a fighter pilot in the Navy to be. But yeah, so not this man. This is David Graeber, the guy that died during COVID, but he was the man who was part of the Occupy movement, and he wrote that book, a key piece of the Occupy movement, and 10 and 11, and he wrote that book, Debt, the First 10,000 Years, which is awesome. Everyone should read that book. It'll really change the way that you regard the world you live in. So I just thought I would read this essay entitled Bullshit Jobs. Now, this essay became a whole book, which is hilarious. So the essay is meant to be kind of funny, so I'll try to give it a humorous inflection here. All right, this essay, as mentioned by David Graeber, the famed anthropologist, from 2013. And the essay is entitled On the Phenomenon of Bullshit Jobs. In the year 1930, John Maynard Keynes predicted that by century's end, technology would have advanced sufficiently that countries like Great Britain or the United States would have achieved a 15-hour work week. There's every reason to believe he was right. In technological terms, we are quite capable of this. And yet, it didn't happen. Instead, technology has been marshaled, if anything, to figure out ways to make us all work more. In order to achieve this, jobs have had to be created that are effectively pointless. Huge swaths of people in Europe and North America in particular spend their entire working lives performing tasks they secretly believe do not really need to be performed. The moral and spiritual damage that comes from this situation is profound. It is a scar across our collective soul, yet virtually no one talks about it. Why did Keynes's promised utopia, still being eagerly awaited in the 60s, never materialize? The standard line today is that he didn't figure in the massive increase in consumerism. Given the choice between less hours and more toys and pleasures, we've collectively chosen the latter. This presents a nice morality tale, but even a moment's reflection shows it can't really be true. Yes, we've witnessed the creation of an endless variety of new jobs and industries since the 20s, but very few have anything to do with production and distribution of sushi, iPhones, or fancy sneakers. So what are these new jobs precisely? A recent report comparing employment in the U.S. between 1910 and 2000 gives us a clear picture, and I note one pretty much exactly echoed in the UK. Over the course of the last century, the number of workers employed as domestic servants in industry and in the farm sector has collapsed dramatically. At the same time, professional, managerial, clerical, sales, and service workers tripled, growing from 1/4 to 3/4 of total employment. In other words, productive jobs have, just as predicted, been largely automated away. Even if you count industrial workers globally, including the toiling masses in India and China, such workers are still not nearly so large as no larger percentage of the world population as they used to be. But rather than allowing a massive reduction of working hours to free the world's population to pursue their own projects, pleasures, visions, and ideas, we have seen the ballooning not even so much of the service sector as of the administrative sector, up to and including the creation of whole new industries like financial services or telemarketing, or the unprecedented expansion of sectors like corporate law, academic and health administration, human resources, and public relations. And these numbers do not even reflect all those people whose job it is to provide administrative, technical, or security support for these industries, or for that matter, the whole host of ancillary industries, dog washers and all-night pizza delivery men that only exist because someone else is spending so much of their time working in all the other ones. These are what I propose to call bullshit jobs. It's as if someone were out there making up pointless jobs just for the sake of keeping us all working. And here, precisely, lies the mystery. In capitalism, this is precisely what is not supposed to happen. Sure, in the old and efficient socialist states like the Soviet Union, where unemployment was considered both a right and a sacred duty, the system made up as many jobs as it had to. This is why in Soviet department stores, it took 3 clerks to sell a piece of meat. But of course, this is the very sort of problem market competition is supposed to fix. According to economic theory, at least, the last thing a profit-seeking firm is going to do is shell out money to workers they don't really need to employ. Still, somehow, it happens. While corporations may engage in ruthless downsizing, the layoffs and speed-ups invariably fall on that class of people who are actually making, moving, fixing, and maintaining things. Through some strange alchemy no one can quite explain, the number of salaried paper pushers ultimately seems to expand, and more employees find themselves, not unlike Soviet workers actually, working 40 or even 50-hour weeks on paper, but effectively working 15 hours just as Keynes predicted, since the rest of their time is spent organizing or attending motivational seminars, updating their Facebook profiles, or downloading TV box sets. The answer clearly isn't economic, it's moral and political. The ruling class has figured out that a happy and productive population with free time on their hands is a mortal danger. Think of what started to happen when this even began to be approximated in the 60s. And on the other hand, the feeling that work is a moral value in itself and that anyone not willing to submit themselves to some kind of intense work discipline for most of their waking hours deserves nothing is extraordinarily convenient for them. Once, when contemplating the apparently endless growth of administrative responsibilities in British academic departments, I came up with one possible vision of hell. Hell is a collection of individuals who are spending the bulk of their time working on a task they don't like and are not especially good at. Say they were hired because they were excellent cabinet makers and then discover they are expected to spend a great deal of their time frying fish. Nor does the task really need to be done. At least there's only a very limited number of fish that needs to be fried. Yet somehow they all become so obsessed with resentment at the thought that some of their coworkers might be spending more of their time making cabinets and not doing their fair share of the fish frying responsibilities, that before long, there's an endless pile of useless, badly cooked fish piling up all over the workshop, and it's all that anyone really does. I think this is actually a pretty accurate depiction of the moral dynamics of our own economy. Now, I realize any such argument is going to run into immediate objections. Who are you to say what jobs are really necessary? What is necessary anyway? You're an anthropology professor. What's the need for that? And indeed, a lot of tabloid readers would take the existence of my job as the very definition of wasteful social expenditure. And on one level, this is obviously true. There can be no objective measure of social value. Well, I would not presume to tell someone who is convinced they are making a meaningful contribution to the world that really they are not. But what about those people who are themselves convinced that their jobs are meaningless? Not long ago, I got back in touch with a school friend who I hadn't seen since I was 15. I was amazed to discover that in the interim, he had become first a poet, then the frontman in an indie rock band. I'd heard some of his songs on the radio, having no idea the singer was someone I actually knew. He was obviously brilliant, innovative, and his work had unquestionably brightened and improved the lives of people all over the world. Yet, after a couple of unsuccessful albums, he'd lost his contract and played with debts and a newborn daughter, ended up, as he put it, taking the default choice of so many directionless folk, law school. Now he's a corporate lawyer in a prominent New York firm. He was the first to admit that his job was utterly meaningless, contributed nothing to the world, and in his own estimation, should not really exist. There's a lot of questions one could ask here, starting with, what does it say about our society that it seems to generate an extremely limited demand for talentless poet musicians, but an apparently infinite demand for specialists in corporate law? Answer. If 1% of the population controls most of the disposable wealth, what we call the market reflects what they think is useful or important, not anybody else. But even more, it shows that most people in pointless jobs are ultimately aware of it. In fact, I'm not sure I ever met a corporate lawyer who didn't think their job was bullshit. The same goes for almost all new industries outlined above. There is a whole class of salaried professionals that, should you meet them at parties and admit that you do something that might be considered interesting, an anthropologist, for example, will want to avoid even discussing their line of work entirely. Give them a few drinks, and they'll launch into tirades about how pointless and stupid their job really is. There is a profound psychological violence here. How can one even begin to speak of dignity in labor when one secretly feels one's job should not exist? How could it not create a sense of deep rage and resentment? Yet, it is the peculiar genius of our society that its rulers have figured out a way, as in the case of the fish fryers, to ensure that rage is directed precisely against those who actually get to do meaningful work. For instance, in our society, there seems to be a general rule that the more obviously one's work benefits other people, the less one is likely to be paid for it. Again, an objective measure is hard to find, but one easy way to get a sense is to ask, what would happen if this entire class of people were simply to disappear? Say what you like about nurses, garbage collectors, or mechanics, it's obvious that were they to vanish in a puff of smoke, the results would be immediate and catastrophic. A world without teachers or dock workers would soon be in trouble, and even one without science fiction writers or ska musicians would clearly be a lesser place. It's not entirely clear how humanity would suffer were all private equity CEOs, lobbyists, PR researchers, actuaries, telemarketers, bailiffs, or legal consultants to similarly vanish. Many suspect it might improve markedly. Yet, apart from a handful of well-touted exceptions like doctors, the rule holds surprisingly well. Even more perverse, there seems to be a broad sense that this is the way things should be. This is one of the secret strengths of right-wing populism. You can see it when tabloids whip up resentment against tube workers for paralyzing London during contract disputes. The very fact that tube workers can paralyze London shows that their work is actually necessary. But this seems to be precisely what annoys people. It's even clear in the United States, where Republicans have had remarkable success mobilizing resentment against school teachers and auto workers, and not significantly against the school administrators or the auto industry executives who actually caused the problems for their supposedly bloated wages and benefits. It's as if they are being told, but you get to teach children or make cars, you get to have real jobs, and on top of that, you have the nerve to also expect middle-class pensions and health care? If someone had designed a work regime perfectly suited to maintaining the power of finance capital, it's hard to see how he or she could have done a better job. Real productive workers are relentlessly squeezed and exploited. The remainder are divided between a terrorized stratum of the universally reviled unemployed and a larger stratum who are basically paid to do nothing in positions designed to make them identify with the perspectives and sensibilities of the ruling class, managers, administrators, etc., and particularly its financial avatars, but at the same time foster a simmering resentment against anyone whose work has a clear and undeniable social value. Clearly, the system was never consciously designed. It emerged from almost a century of trial and error, but is the only explanation for why, despite our technological capacities, we're not all working 3 to 4 hour days. Okay, that's it. And just by way of a discussion on that article, that essay by the dearly departed David Graeber, I just want to remember the presidential candidacy of Andrew Yang. I'm sure you remember Mr. Yang, Brian. He was going around the country, hitting up the Joe Rogan podcast.
Universal basic income.
That was his calling card. His idea was, the thing that drove me crazy about Andrew Yang is that he had this line on the campaign trail where he said, "We didn't know that capitalism was going to be eaten by its child, technology." And that's extremely frustrating for Yang to say that, because Capitals Volume 2 and 3 were published in 1892. It's like, yeah, no, I think that there's a huge intellectual tradition of noticing that problem that capitalism eventually gets eaten by its child, technology.
Well, I'm sure that Andrew Yang can't kind of go out there and be like, well, Marx was right, if he's serious about winning his candidacy, unfortunately.
Well, that's a salient point. You're right, Brian. But it still drove me crazy nonetheless. I remember that no one took Andrew Yang, even as it was, no one took Yang's campaign seriously at all, right? He was just laughed at. They would, the news media would intentionally leave him off the polls, even though he put and include the names of people polling beneath him. They would put the wrong picture. They would put the name Andrew Yang, but he put a wrong picture. Like when they had the filter for Joe Rogan's face to make him seem sick during the darkest days of the COVID madness.
Yeah, this was 2016, right?
2020.
2020.
That's when Yang made his run.
Is that true?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So I guess they stifled Bernie in 2016.
And in 2020, yeah, for sure. I did look this up. Yang had suspended his campaign by February of 2020, so he didn't even make it to Super Tuesday. But the thing, so I remember that Crystal and Sagar, they were on the Hill's Rising. Do you remember this, Brian? This was like the Hill is this Republican rag or this conservative rag, but they had this news YouTube show, Rising, and the two co-hosts, Crystal and Sagar, brought Yang in and gave him a serious interview and actually gave the man the time of day versus ridiculing him or intentionally laughing, intentionally minimizing his candidacy. So this is the reason I became a riser, and now I get all my news from Breaking Point. So I think you're from the same era, eh, Brian? Isn't this the same time you got on the Crystal and Sagar thing?
It was pretty much. Yeah. But yeah, it's a story as old as time. Basically, socialist candidate has all kinds of support and gets stymied anyway.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just in light of David Graeber's article we just read, I do think there's that universal basic income, what Andrew Yang was touting, is totally the wrong approach, right? The problems when you think about John Maynard Keynes' prediction that by the year 2000 we'll all be working 15-hour work weeks. The solution to that, to the issue of technology taking on more and more of the productive capacity of society. Well, the issue is, if you do obviously you're going to have the higher and higher structural unemployment as technology bears more and more of the burden. And Yang's solution is just to tax that production and then give that money to the growing pool of structurally unemployed, right? But when you play that tape forward to its finale, when you extrapolate forward in time, that you get what you're going to get is a growing pool of idle people who are paid by a growing pool of productive people, and they're going to be living along. You can just see where that would create tension. It would be good neither for the idle people nor for the people still stuck working the 40-hour work week. So what you want to do is the more technology takes over production is you want to roll back the work week in proportion to that. So that way the benefits of technology are shared with everyone in society versus just being captured by the business owners who can then fire their redundant workers, only to find out that, when done en masse, that process, just yields so many unemployed people that there's no one left to buy the product. So we do need someone to buy the fruits of production, the goods and services that the economy churns out. And the best way to do that is to instead of having some people work 40 hours a week and some people have none and have them be neighbors, just make everyone work 20 hours a week. Do you see what I'm saying? Right, just rolling back the length of the work week is the way to do this, not universal basic income.
Well, I can't really imagine what the incentive is for our corporate overlords to roll back the work week to 15 hours a week.
Yeah, they don't want to have to pay for, if they don't want to have to pay for, if their business requires 100 employees, they don't want to pay for 100 households, right? They'd much rather pay for 50 households or 25 if they can get away with it.
Well, if Andrew Yang, got to do his thing and, there was some kind of UBI of like $2,000 a month, man, I think I would definitely keep working my job and just get $2,000 more a month. Although if it turns out I'm also getting taxed $2,000, well, that's not very exciting. But I don't know. Well, I'd at least be willing to give it a try. But yeah, I think you do have a problem with idle workers. You'd want to have the UBI to be like enough that you're still incentivized to get a job, but it kind of offsets the crazy nature of our society.
Yeah, I regard basically all of Keynesianism, right? The idea that you just tax the rich this is what he's famous for. You tax people during the good times and then run a deficit during bad times, to boost the economy. That is like a band-aid. Right? The issue really here, the issue here is that money should be like a circulatory system, like the water cycle, and we have to keep the money moving and not pooling up uselessly in people's bank accounts. And taxing the rich is one way to fix that problem, but it's really just a band-aid. What you could have is you could have sensible money creation, or the silver bullet that I always like to trot out is having the workers themselves own the corporate structures, right? If you have a band of workers and the decisions at the factory, let's say you have an old time industrial mill, and the workers get a piece of technology that's going to cut all their workday in half, they're not all going to vote to fire half themselves, and they're all going to vote to reduce their workday down to 20 hours versus fire half of us. No one's going to vote for the fire half of us option, of course, right? So there's in a sense, just having more hands on the ship's wheel than just the ownership class, having the workers too in some sort of democracy is one way that you could avoid having to do a UBI tax regime, and you could instead just let those sort of compensation decisions or let those decisions about the work week be made in a democratic process. Because you're right, the problem is that one person at the top of these giant companies has complete control of it, and to them, their only number they care about is the profit, and to them, the more workers they can fire, the better off they're going to be. They have every incentive to fire workers, and letting someone with every incentive to fire workers make all the decisions is a sure way to get all your workers fired and blow up the capitalist economy, because then there will be no one with any money to buy the products, so.
Well, I don't know about David Graeber's hypothesis that there's a mysterious force making us, pay workers less and admin workers more. I mean, there is what we just talked about there, where the political forces just try to stymie any socialist effort, and so that probably, I guess that maybe seems like a better explanation. I guess that's really building on Graeber's observation.
Yeah. He does take pains to say, obviously, the system is not designed, but it encourages this thing where if your work is fulfilling, people will take that as a form of payment and accept, school teachers, and accept less money for, and that's why the rule is, generally the more useful your job actually is, the less you can pay, which is a funny rule of thumb.
Well, maybe the Democrats will let us have a real primary in 2028 now.
A real primary? Imagine such a thing. What a novel concept, Brian. I wonder if that would help them win some elections, possibly.
I don't know. We'll see.
All right. Well, I propose, Brian, that you and I take a short break, and you can, take stock of your arsenal, and we'll come back, and then we get some Breaking Points podcast clips to pay for the listeners. And we're back. All right. Well, Brian, you only collapsed briefly during the break, but you back up and animated again. So I do appreciate the dedication there. Would not do to leave our audience hanging even for a week. And so you're over there propped up, clinging to life.
You've got to want it.
Okay. All right. Well, I suppose we should get right into it, Brian. This past week, sometimes on Fridays, Breaking Points has one of these Beyond the Headlines with James Lee. You might have seen them pop up every once. He's got some investigative reporting going on, so he's a little bit of a supplementary content provider over there at Breaking Points with Crystal and Sagar and Ryan and Emily. And so the Friday before last, he had this man, Jared Dillian, on, who's like an investment banker and a former muckety-muck. You'll hear him rattle off a few of his credentials and bona fides in a second here. And the man has one of our favorite things on the System Failure podcast, a prophecy of financial doom. This man is predicting that private equities will be the new, as mortgages were to the 2008 financial crisis. This man thinks that private equity is to the pending brouhaha in the financial system. So I suppose the best thing to do is let the man himself make the case. And so, Brian, without further ado, if you could be so kind as to play clip number 1.
To help us break all of this down, I'm joined today by Jared Dillian, a financial author and former Wall Street trader who ran the ETF desk at Lehman Brothers from 2004 to 2008, giving him a front row seat to the global financial crisis. And lately, he's been sounding the alarm on what he believes is the next big bubble, private equity. Jared, thanks so much for joining us today on Breaking Points.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So before we dive into the bubble itself, I do want to talk a little bit about the mechanics of private equity. Specifically, I opened this segment earlier on with an example of Jo-Ann Fabrics, a PE-owned company that went bankrupt earlier this year despite 95% of its stores being profitable. So can you explain why a company that's so insanely profitable can still end up being bankrupt under private equity ownership? And when it does go bankrupt, does that itself also impact the profitability of private equity?
Yeah, so I can speak to that a little bit. First of all, let's just back up a second and talk about what private equity is. You touched on it a little bit. But private equity is when you have a private equity firm, an entity that borrows money to buy a private company, not a public company, but a private company, a private business. And you mentioned a bunch of them, car washes and vet clinics and dental practice and stuff like that. And the idea is they will hold them for a medium length period of time, 3 to 5 years. And they will do some managerial stuff to improve profitability, which usually involves cutting costs a lot and basically improving the financials so they can sell the business at a significant profit 3 to 5 years later. That's how it's supposed to work. I don't know the specifics of the Jo-Ann Stores deal, but I can tell you that private equity frequently does things like dividend recaps, right? And a dividend recap is when you have a private business in the portfolio and the sponsors will borrow a bunch of money to pay dividends to the owners, basically sucking money out of the business. And the one thing that should be said about private equity is that the difference between a private equity owner and a founder, the founder wants the business to last forever. Like whoever founded Jo-Ann Stores, they want it to last for hundreds and hundreds of years. They want it to survive them. A private equity owner doesn't really care. They don't care if the business goes bankrupt, if they got their money out, right? So it's really about time horizons. It's about thinking very, very long term versus thinking very short term. And that, I think, is the fundamental problem with private equity in this country, is that you have these owners with a short time horizon, and they're really indifferent as to whether the business succeeds or fails.
So what you're saying is there's actually ways to pull money out of, say, Jo-Ann's Fabric, have them go bankrupt, but still make money for the fund.
Yes, and like I said, I don't know the specifics of that particular deal, but that happens a lot.
Yeah, okay, so there you have it, a portrait of the private equity industry. You may recall, Brian, that this is Bain Capital, Mitt Romney, how he made his dollars running one of these vulture capital funds that just they seize on the carcass of some business and just pull all the assets out of it and let it collapse, and then but then they don't care, like they just pile all the debt and all the expenses onto the corporate name, which is not their name, or they hide behind the limited liability corporation, and then just let the business tank, let it default on all its debts, let it go through bankruptcy. Because they don't. It really shows. It really shows why it matters so much who has their hand on the ship's wheel of these companies. They can be operated for social good, or they can be operated for social ill, and oftentimes. We'd like to make it so that their profit aligns with social good, but it can just as easily align with social ill. And, well, this is a great example.
Yeah, well, the bankruptcy of Joann's Fabrics is, it's pretty egregious. I've been there a few times, and like a lot of women love crafts, and it's always been pretty bustling in the couple times I've been there, and that's just a shocking state of affairs, I would say.
I used to buy the Henleys from J. Crew that came with the plastic buttons, which displeased me, so I would go to Joann's and get some metal buttons and sew them on there.
Nice. Not anymore, huh?
No, yeah, I can get some. Yeah, I don't do the J. Crew circuit anymore.
Well, the Joann's is closed too.
That true. I mean, I'm sure I could get buttons, but the other guy to mention is Richard Gere. That was his job in that movie Pretty Woman. Remember that with Julia Roberts from back in the day? Like his whole job was like investment. Private equity, buying up these companies and whacking them up, So
I don't think I've actually seen Pretty Woman, but I guess that makes sense.
Oh yeah, it's a solid film from when I was a kid. What year? Maybe 93 or something like that. I'd have to, maybe 95. I don't know, but yeah. Well, that was his job in Pretty Woman. All right. Well, Brian, can we get on to point number 2?
I want to ask you a little bit about one of these many alarming statistics that I've seen. Is that private equity firms have taken out trillions of dollars. The number I was looking at was $3.8 trillion in adjustable rate loans, which is more than double the $1 trillion of risky adjustable rate mortgages that triggered the 2008 financial crisis. So I'm wondering, is this the kind of red flag you're looking at when you have said that private equity is the next big bubble? Or if not, what kind of indicators are you looking at that makes you think that private equity is a bubble?
Well, I mean, the adjustable rate debt is really an issue. I mean, if 10-year notes right now are 4.5%, if they go to 6.5%, and the interest rates on these loans go up accordingly, then that's a problem. Just like it was in the financial crisis. Like if you've ever seen The Big Short, they talked about these subprime loans. They had these teaser rates, and the interest rates go up, and people can't afford them, right?
Yikes. Yeah, so the connection here, right? This is why I always talk about the yield on the 10-year T-note as the real, right? That's like one of the first dominoes to fall, and then the stock market collapse is like the last domino to fall. And part of the reason it's like the 10-year T-note, of course, is government debt, and we had a pop in the interest rates again this week because of the massive deficits. Obviously, you were going to get to a point where the interest on the debt is more than the rest of our whole budget, and when you get to a point where the debt itself, like we're just paying all of this, where we like physically can't pay the debt back. We're like eventually we will end up defaulting on it, and so like you saw interest rates go up when people who potentially are going to be the buyers of these treasury bonds see that we're stacking up these massive deficits, and that the Republican spending bill just blows past whatever savings Doge generated, and then deficit funds tax cuts even further. Right? When the people who are potentially supposed to buy these bonds, these treasury bonds, see all that, they demand a higher price because they're going, this is risky behavior. This is clearly not sustainable. And when and that causes the benchmark yield, in the 10-year T-note, the supposedly risk-free, the supposed price of risk-free, debt, the price of risk-free money, and you see that start to drift up. Well, that causes a huge problem for these huge volumes of debt in the economy that are adjustable rate, or subprime in the mortgage days. And in this case, they're all crappy loans that these vulture capitalists like the Mitt Romneys and the Richard Gere's of the world took out on your local veterinarian's office. Took out in the name of your local veterinarian's office. And so, of course, when it turns out those loans are never going to be paid back because these businesses are just being burned as if they're disposable, then the banks are going to have to reckon with all that in their balance sheet, and you get another debt crisis. The man is talking here about derivatives also on the mortgage. There's the actual loans themselves, like in 2008, the actual mortgages, and in this case, the private equity loans that are adjustable rate. And then there's all these other derivatives on top of that. All these other bets on that, on the paying back of those loans, credit default swaps and collateralized debt obligations, as they were called in 2008. So it really shows how the layer cake of investments from its baseline, supposedly risk-free 10-year T-note, government debt, through the more reputable corporate debt, through through some of the fly-by-night corporate debt, to some of the the nicer stocks, to some of the penny stocks. It's all different strata of quality of debt here, and it's all benchmarks, this 10-year T-note. So, okay, so let us go to clip number 3, Brian.
The thing I think that has alarmed me the most in the last month or two is the fact that university endowments are trying to sell their private equity holdings at a discount. And you saw that Yale was the first to do this. So Yale, the history of Yale is the Yale endowment was run by a guy named David Swensen, who really liked alternatives like PE and hedge funds. And he built this university endowment portfolio full of very illiquid stuff, but it beat pretty much all the competitors, all the other university endowments. And now, university endowments in particular are incredibly illiquid because they're loaded up on private equity. And Yale says, look, if we're going to panic, we want to be the first ones to panic. And they're selling $6 billion out of their portfolio, $6 billion of private equity, and they're willing to take a significant haircut. So my guess is that they'll probably sell it for $5 billion, somewhere around there. And then that calls into question the marks of the holdings of the private equity companies. If they have, say Joann Stores marked at $2 billion, and a large holder of private equity sells at a 17% discount, what does that mean for the marks within the portfolio? They probably should be a lot lower, and then they start lowering the marks, and then it turns into panic, and then it's a run on the bank, basically. That's kind of how I see this playing out, right?
Yeah, can you talk a little bit more about that? What would a bubble actually look like? Because we're not only talking, you have a bunch of endowments, but you also have, let's say, the pension funds, retirement funds being heavily invested in private equity through something called a collateralized loan obligation, CLO, kind of similar to what we saw in the financial crisis with CDOs, packaging debt and selling that as a financial product. So what kinds of repercussions could we be looking at if the bubble, if the private equity bubble does burst?
Well, one thing is that I think the last statistic I saw was that private equity owned companies employ at least 8 million people in the United States. Okay. And if there is a downturn in private equity and these companies are being liquidated, you will see very rapid job losses in the United States. So you could see potentially 10, 20, 30% of these positions go away. So you could have 1 to 2 million people lose their jobs in the United States. Veterinary practices, HVAC businesses, dental practices, stuff like that. They will go out of business. They will simply go out of business, and then you'll have less options. For sure, this is coming. This is absolutely coming.
Well, it seems like Yale, selling at a loss their private equity holdings seems like an extremely dubious omen.
Yeah.
But at least, private equity stinks. So, maybe it'll go away and not be bailed out. And then we can get our Red Lobsters and Joann's Fabrics back.
Well, they're going to talk more about bailouts as we go along here. But yeah, so the idea that there's now all this pressure on the universities for sitting on these massive endowments, and some of them are starting to liquidate those endowments because they see that maybe now is the time to. They might be required to de-invest themselves or something in the future. But the idea that Yale's triggering a massive sell-off, the man's right. It could be the spark, the Tinder or whatever. Yeah, it's interesting. It's just interesting to see, like he's talking about the bridge there between the universities and the unemployment is that, like, obviously if you were going to the holders of these companies would start liquidating them as they collapsed in value, and then they would go out of business if they didn't find buyers and had to be liquidated, like Joanne's did. Pretty ominous stuff there. I suppose it's time then for clip number 4, Brian.
One point I want to make is private equity made sense 10 or 15 years ago, right? Because interest rates were zero and they could borrow a ton of money at very low interest rates, right? And valuations were very low. Like they could buy portfolio companies at 4 to 5 times earnings, right? Well, you fast forward to today and interest rates are 4.5% on 10-year notes and valuations are 10 to 12 times, and it just doesn't make any sense. And the problem is there are 10,000 plus private equity firms in the U.S. Investors are plowing money into them. They have so much money to put to work. There's competition for deals. The valuations have gotten even more absurd. And if private equity is buying a business at 12 to 14 times, there's no way they can make money at it. Right, so they're either going to sell it or it's going to go bankrupt.
Yeah. The man was talking about the 2000s when there was very low interest rates, so we could finance some expensive military misadventures abroad. But now that interest rates are higher and look like they may creep higher, now there's no place for buying these already heavily overvalued businesses. With expensive debt when they used to buy, not so overvalued businesses with cheap debt. So, yeah, it seems like the man lays out a compelling case. Of course, it does seem like so many of the things in our economy, it's just a ticking time bomb. Okay, one last clip on this one, Brian, and then hopefully, and the man will put a fine point on it, and we can talk about those bailouts.
You mentioned bankruptcy. The term bailout comes into play because something is going to have to happen to backstop all of this, because like you said, we can't just have all of these services disappear. And thinking back to 2008, and I know you were there personally and you saw some of these things, we saw the government promise a bailout of the American working class, but ended up the bailout was just for Wall Street. And so what I'm wondering is, this time around, I'm seeing some of the similar trends happening where a lot of the financial risk is being transferred to the working class again. Do you think that's kind of a fair comparison? Who's likely to end up holding the bag, basically?
Well, I think that this problem is on the White House's radar. I think they know about it, and it's kind of a slow detonating bomb. Right? There's really nothing they can do about it at the moment. Would there be a bailout? Maybe. Who would they bail out? Well, just like in 2008, they bailed out. Well, first of all, talk about 2008 a little bit. With TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, the federal government took equity stakes in every bank in the country, whether they wanted it or not. But they disproportionately took larger equity stakes in the big 5 banks. They got $25 billion apiece. So if there were to be a bailout of private equity, for sure it would be the names like Blackstone, Apollo, TPG, KKR, stuff like that, which would be grossly unfair. And we've seen this movie before. It's hard not to be cynical about it, but that's probably what would happen.
I think this is. I think there's more to come from this. We don't know exactly what's going to transpire quite yet. We know there's something on the horizon that doesn't seem quite right. So kind of fascinating, but at the same time very disturbing.
Well, hopefully the Donald just doesn't have the political capital to bail out these companies, I think is what you'd have to hope for, right?
Yeah. Man, yeah, it sure is wild. The much ado on this podcast I've made about the debt forgivenesses of the ancient Mesopotamian kings I learned about from Dr. Michael Hudson. But that was the piece of technology they used to keep their societies from collapsing. They would periodically... It's like in the Stanley Cup, like instead of having one Super Bowl, where it's a winner-take-all single game. The ancient kings of Mesopotamia whacked up they have a 7-game series, right? They periodically reset the scoreboard to give everyone a consentive to continue playing, because when the game gets to be 500 to nothing, 2 billion to nothing, when the score gets too lopsided, the only way to keep everyone playing is to reset the scoreboard. And like, the need for resetting the scoreboard is obvious, and the rich get bailouts nonstop, as we've seen throughout our adult lives here, Brian. But when it comes to regular plebes like you and me getting forgiveness, we get the moral arguments about how it's, you took out the debt, you took the risk, so you have to, stick with it. It's like, when adults come to an agreement, and then circumstances change, sometimes they have to both acknowledge that circumstances have changed and revise their agreement versus one person petulantly sticking to the agreement, even as circumstances have obviously, evolved. And so you can it's a good example is the student loans versus the PPE loans that all these businesses took out during COVID that all got forgiven. You can find any number of hilarious screenshots of some Republican congressman saying about how students need to take out loans, that took out loans and need to pay them back, and then someone screenshots, because all that PPE data publicly available, so someone just screenshots how this congressperson's companies, got forgiven for all these hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's like, obviously, when it comes to finance, it's money from the future. It's access to money from the future. And sometimes you get to the future and that money's not really there. And the question is, what do we do with these loans? And if you're the Roman Empire or you're America in 2008, you say there will be no forgiveness, only foreclosure. But obviously, you do need forgivenesses to keep the economy running, as we did in 2008. It would have been the end of the economy if we didn't bail out the banks, but the banks, so. Anyway, pretty good stuff there.
So I think that just like, the curse of being a millennial is that our whole adult life is everything's just kind of gotten worse, right?
Yeah.
And so we just need like one real election, maybe, is all it would take to kind of not be on this negative trajectory all the time.
We arrived just in time to experience the post-war stability in our childhood and experience none of it in our adulthood, as the whole post-World War II comes unraveled during our early adult and formative years. It's the lament of the millennial generation, eh?
Indeed.
Yeah. Well, we got one final item for you all today, and that is a brief TikTok from our main man, the TikTok conspiracist, Ian Carroll. He's got this great. I'll never forget having the experience. I met some German people in South Africa in 2021. I was there with the lovely Tracy. We were seeing the world, and on the same day, 2 different Germans sent me this Rumble video about just 2 unrelated Germans. I don't know, it must have been making the rounds, in the fatherland or something like that in Germany. It must have been making the rounds because they both felt the need to forward me this video despite not really knowing me that well. But it was a great documentary about how BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, these 3 financial behemoths in the US, all own each other, and so really are one entity and not the 3 that they appear to be. So Mr. Ian Carroll is now going to give us now. So the problem here. Everyone should go look up this video on their own. You can just put in Ian Carroll's last name. His last name has 2 R's and 2 L's, and you'll get this video. It's very visual. The way that the way that he is going to be breaking, and this is an audio podcast, so you're just going to have to listen to the explanations, but understand that he'll take an entity like State Street and he's holding up a grid, like it's a 10 by 10 grid, so there's 100 squares, and then the percentages owned by different other financial entities are color coded, so you get a square of 100 smaller squares, like a grid with 100 spaces, and then the different percentages are all are figured in there. And so that's the image that we're going with here, and it will really illustrate the way that there are levels to reality that we're allowed to know, the model of the mystery schools, which we'll be talking much more about after this clip.
Yeah, well, this is the video we alluded to last week, eh?
Yes. Yeah, that's right. I forgot about that. Very good recall, Brian. Yes.
All right.
What if I told you that all corporations are actually just one giant mega corporation? And I'm not talking about metaphorically. And I'm not talking about BlackRock. I'm talking about what's really behind BlackRock. See, we hit 1 million followers on TikTok this week, and I've been waiting to post this video since the very first video that I made. laying the groundwork of understanding so that we're all going to understand this now that we're here. So let's break it down real simple. If you're going to go grocery shopping at a corporate grocery store, all of these corporations are owned by these institutions. They're highlighted in red if they're on all 4 of these sheets. They're darker orange if they're on 3 of them, and light orange if they're on 2. And there's only a couple that only appear once. It's mostly the same money. But we go deeper. If you go for the biggest tech companies, it's basically the exact same list for all 4 of these. That would be Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, Fidelity, T. Rowe Price, Geode, which is similar to Fidelity Associated, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley. And then Northern Trust is on 3 of them, and Capital World Investors is the exact same thing as Capital Research and Management Company. So you might think, okay, these are the institutions that own the whole stock market. But who owns them? And see, if you've been around here for a minute, you already know. They all own each other. Just a giant cross-ownership pool. And this is where it gets really interesting. Because see, way back before I'd even posted a single video, I was sitting in my office reading this report from an anonymous user on Reddit. And he had noticed the exact same thing that I'm talking about right now. And he wrote a program to put all that data into a visualization so we can see who owns who. And I'm about to show you what he figured out. Let's take BlackRock, for example. This is a list of the top institutional owners of BlackRock and how much of the company they own. And if you visualize it, it looks like this, where the whole square is all of BlackRock's stock, and they get a percentage of that square based on how much they own. And the important colors to note are that white symbolizes us, retail investors, and gray symbolizes insiders that work at the company. So that would be like Larry Fink's stock, among other people. And everything else is other giant corporations, investment banks, like BlackRock themselves own a little bit. State Street owns some. Capital World Management owns some. Bank of America owns some. You see how this works? But then you think about it and you're like, well, wait a minute, because all of these institutions are owned by other institutions, right? So what if we put that data in here? Well, he did. And it looks like this. And you realize that all of this that was owned by Merrill Lynch is actually owned by all of these other institutions. And a little bit of us, retail, up there at the top. But here, we've only replaced Merrill Lynch's section. What about all of these guys? Well, then it looks like this. Remember, white is retail investors like you and me, and everything else is giant mega corporations. And if you go one layer deeper, filling in all those corporations with their corporations, you see how this program's working? And so then we simplify it to just black, gray, and white. And this is who owns BlackRock. White is retail investors like you and me. Gray is insiders at all of these corporations like CEOs and other executives. And black is just corporations owning each other. We'll call it Megacorp. This is the same process done for Bank of America and for State Street and for Best Buy, Amazon, Macy's, groceries, food, ingredients, building and selling homes, even less white, meaning us, retail ownership. As far as I can tell, there's only one company on the entire stock market that is not owned by Megacorp. Can you guess who it is? Do you know? It's GameStop. Except that this photo's out of date, because it's from a few years ago. It probably looks more like this, if you believe the public info, which is a big if. But more on that another time. This is not a video about GameStop. This is about Megacorp. Because see, when all of the owners own each other, all of their interests are aligned. BlackRock wants State Street to do well because State Street wants BlackRock to do well because they both own each other. So who is the real final boss behind all the money? Well, isn't that the $1 million question? And ever since I've been asking those more important questions, my follower growth went from this to this. So you're not going to find those answers on this channel. You're going to have to go follow me in other places. All I'll say for now is that the next time you buy a product from a corporation like Nike or Costco or Best Buy or Amazon or any of these corporations, you're buying it from the mega corporation. They're all owned by the same big money. And it's all one big siphon, just vacuuming money out of our pockets up to the people on top. We'll make another video about how exactly they do that shortly.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, well, basically every corporation, just the visual is just there's very little retail ownership and very little ownership, and then the rest of it's, Megacorp. And it probably circles back to David Graeber pretty effectively. Like, if you're wondering why we had this, admin situation, it's got to have something to do with, every with Megacorp just kind of owning every corporation, right? And then the other thing is, I do think it's a cathartic video if you lost like thousands of dollars in this whole GameStop business, like I did. It is interesting that apparently GameStop is somehow keeping it real, and that maybe the GameStop saga is not over yet.
Yeah. So for those not in the know, the GameStop saga happened in 2020. GameStop was one of these stores that was spiraling the drain. Their business model of selling physical discs, video games on physical discs, was in a state of collapse because everyone was downloading their video games over the internet, and no one was going to a brick and mortar retailer to buy discs or games or what have you anymore. And so because of that, the institutional investors heavily shorted GameStop. They engaged in what's called naked short selling, where you basically sell the obligation to these companies are selling the obligation to sell a share of GameStop stock in the future for cash in the present, on the assumption that the price of GameStop would eventually collapse and they would make a ton of money doing this, right? So what you have is institutional investors short selling. That is to say, they're selling the obligation to buy a stock in the future, and if the stock goes up, suddenly people will exercise those options, and those companies would all have, those institutional investors will all have to go out and buy GameStop stocks to cover their bets. And when that happens, it causes the price to go even higher. So even more short sellers then have to buy GameStop shares to cover their bets. And then the price goes even higher, and you get stuck in a positive feedback loop. It's called a short squeeze, and that's just what happened when the internet found out in January of 2020. Was that January of 20? It was January of 21, eh, Brian? It wasn't 20, it was 21. In January of 21, the internet found out that institutional investors had sold shorts on the order of like 2.6, 2.7 times the amount of actual shares of GameStops there were, all but guaranteeing a short squeeze scenario, right? There were many more promises to buy short squeeze, just to buy GME stock than there were actual stock, that the company had sold. And indeed, the price started creeping up, and it went up like, 5-6x, something like that, before finally all of the big trading platforms, your Merrill Lynch's, your Robinhoods, all of them pulled the buy button off GME stock and only left the sell button, thereby cheating on behalf of the institutional investors who've been caught with their pants down. And just another example of like what the man talked about at the end of the Breaking Points clip about private equity, about how the institutions always cheat and win, and we always lose even when we thought we won, as just retail nobodies. So yeah, it is interesting, and it is a sad portrait of the state of capitalism, that the markets are all a facade, and that really it's just what apparently seems like a few firms competing in a market is really all just one firm with a couple of masks over the last mile. And that's the reality of what we've got here. There's no real competition at all. It's just we've got this massive superstructure just hoovering up wealth. And the thing that fascinates me is the way that this superstructure, this parasite, as Dr. Michael Hudson calls it, the fire sector, the way that it conceals itself as a parasite does. All good parasites have some way of, some agent, some way to numb the host so that it doesn't realize it's hosting a parasite. And really, the mystery school structure is the way that that's accomplished. And we'll briefly talk about the mystery school structure, but to understand it, you have to cast your mind all the way back to 196 BC, when the Roman Senate cracked down on the Bacchanalia, the ecstatic festival, outdoor festival of Dionysus, which had fallen under control of, according to the Roman historian Livy, had fallen under the control of the Campanian witch, Peculia Ania. I guess she had opened up the mysteries to men and was subverting a Roman society that was kind of that was having trouble with its own. The class war was the background. Recently, the ruling class had absconded with most of the spoils of the Roman defeat of Hannibal and the Carthaginians. That had not been shared with most rank and file Romans, and so these all-night crazy bacchanals, these all-night raves, became, just like the rock and roll of the 1960s, a focal point of counterculture against the establishment that had not seen to the needs, that ignored the needs of the poor and, awarded all of its wealth to a tiny minority instead. And so when the Roman Senate, according to Livy, the Roman Senate cracked down and put some 6,000 or 7,000 cultists to death, and then kind of took over the cult. And they didn't destroy it or make, they kind of, the establishment took it over and made it, part of the state procession, and they sort of co-opted it. And so that's why when a couple hundred years later, when a very similar band of renegades rebelled against not the Roman Senate, but now the new Roman Empire, with Tiberius as its emperor, the second, it was like Augustus Tiberius. I think I have that right. And the new ritual where you mix up the magic potions, Dionysus or Bacchus was the wine god, and so the new communion with the god, the wine and bread of the Christian Eucharist, was something you had at a supper inside your house versus outside where everyone could see, and it was very because they feared another crackdown by the establishment who had taken over the Dionysian celebration, the Bacchic celebration 2 centuries prior. You get this mystery school structure to the renegade or rebellious new, fresh-faced Christian religion. Obviously, the early Christians were heavily persecuted by the state, and so they had to meet in dark places like the super creepy necropolis, or like graveyards. They had to hide from authorities. They had to hide from the Roman authorities. And so when Christianity then became itself the authority of the Roman state, it kept that mystery school, the mystery school format, which the Dionysian celebrations had, and Christianity had too, where you don't really know what you're getting into. It's kind of when you have an underground society, that's opposed by the state, you kind of have to have layers of secrecy. And so the church kept that structure, the mystery school structure, right into the Middle Ages. Obviously, when the Bible, the foundation document of Christianity, is written in Latin and only the clergy can read Latin, right? The lay people just have to take the word of the clergy on what the Bible says. So you still have that. You have that structure where only the insiders know what the real revelation is, and the regular lay folks like you and me, Brian, have no idea what the true revelation is at the heart of the organization that we are participating in. And when the church authority collapsed in the late Middle Ages, we've made the case many times that the popes are replaced with the bankers. And we have this system of opaqueness where rank and file people like you and me aren't allowed to see the corporate structure that links together the aristocracy, the upper class, the oligarchy, whatever, the financial elites, what have you. It's very interesting that there's just we do not have a line of sight. You have to rely on Ian Carroll to go and do the research and make a YouTube video about it, because we've got no line of sight as to who it is that actually owns us. So it's just like the Middle Ages when people had no idea what was really in the Bible, and it's just like the mystery schools of Greece and Rome where you had no idea what the sage or prophet or whoever at the center of your religion was talking about until you got to move up the levels. And that same structure is reflected today in the Masonic, the Scottish, the Freemasons, who have their layers of initiation and ultimately culminating on a 33rd degree. To me, the Ian Carroll video, Brian, really sheds a little bit of light onto the mysterious structure of the mystery school we live in. So that was a great video. You turned me on to that video. I mean, I had seen Ian Carroll any number of times, but I didn't know about that specific video. So it was fun to watch, and boy, it sure is fun to get conspiratorial.
All right, cool.
All right. Well, at this point, Brian, I'm going to give you leave to die off, and hopefully be resurrected next week. But let's put you out of your misery. I will invite our System Failure listeners to log on to systemfailure.org. There you can enter in your email address and sign up to receive the weekly newsletters written by yours truly. And if you'd like to get in touch with either Brian or myself, if he does indeed survive this week, you can accomplish that on the About page by clicking on our respective names. Okay, have a great week, folks. We will be back next week with a brand new episode of System Failure.